So let's go ahead and jump into LRA 3. And I'm going to switch the screen here for a moment to show you some pertinent information about that. Typically in LRA 3, you are asked to get a primary source or a number of primary sources for your paper, which begs the question, what is a primary source? If you're going to find one of these, you need to know what one is. Typically in-person classes, when I ask a group of students what is a primary source, the students will say that it's a first-hand account put together by someone, written by someone who actually witnessed an event or had some direct experiences with a particular event or topic. And that is a really good definition. In fact, in many ways, that's sort of the quintessential primary source, especially in the humanities disciplines, the discipline of history being part of that. Probably the best kind of primary source you can get is someone who has put something to written something that reflects on experiences they've had with your topic. And by the way, I say written. Another thing you should know about primary sources is they don't have to be written documents, although those tend to be the most helpful. They could be other things. They could be paintings, they could be maps, they could be physical objects, anything that was produced at that time. Sometimes when students are asked the question, what is a primary source, they also say, well, it's like a diary. Which is also a pretty good example, and that gets at sort of this personalized first-hand account sort of definition, which again is a good one. But it's also important to note that you do not necessarily have to have a first-hand account for something to be a primary source. For example, historical newspaper articles can be primary sources. If a reporter wrote a story about a battle during a historical war, but was not actually experiencing the battle on the battlefield itself, that would still be classified as a primary source. So don't box yourself into a very narrow definition of a primary source. In sum, the basic thing you need to understand is what makes something a primary source in the humanities is time. Time is the most important word. And the reason why, as we shift here in a minute to finding primary sources, that idea of time really is important is it implies then that there is no real primary source database per se. For books and articles, there were specific databases we recommended you go to, not necessarily for primary sources. Primary sources you can find anywhere and everywhere. And what is a primary source for one particular student's research is not necessarily for another, because time is critical. So the time period is what is going to make sense. Now, for some topics, that might be fairly obvious. If you're researching World War I, the primary time period is during World War I. Things created during World War I would be primary sources. Although one of the interesting things to remember about finding things using the World War I example is that World War I was not called World War I during that time. So you have to be careful when you're doing searching, and we'll talk about that in a minute. For other topics, your primary time period is not as obvious. If you're, for example, researching the history of climate change, it sort of begs the question, well, when did climate change happen? Well, this is a slow and evolving process over many, many centuries. And so what you'll need to do as a researcher is pick a time period that's most important to you. Maybe whatever time period or set of decades describe when the first solid scientific discoveries about climate change were happening, or something like that. But again, time is very important. And then I also want to talk about a couple of other keys to success concerning primary sources before we launch into finding them in the databases. The first thing is to know your vocabulary. And so in order to talk about that, I want to tell a brief story and ask a question about it and give you an opportunity to think a little bit about it. So when I was working with a student in a previous semester, an RCI student, whose paper topic was human trafficking, he went in to find a primary source in a historical newspaper database. Went into the database, properly limited to a time period that made sense for his topic. And I think it was between 1900 and 1950. And typed in his topic, human trafficking, spelled the words correctly, and clicked search and got nothing back. And so my question is, what happened? How come this student got nothing back? Well, the reason is that the terminology, or that term, human trafficking, was not used in the deeper historical past. So that's why it's key to know your vocabulary. So you may wonder then, well, okay, if I have a topic and it may contain terminology that's more contemporary, what am I going to search for? How is that going to work? Well, one of the things that's important to do is to tie your topic to specific historical examples. The names of people or groups of people, the names of events, the names of laws or legislation can be very important things for you. And the place that you can find a lot of that information are in the books and articles that you have already obtained as part of this RCI research project. And by the way, another thing I'll say is that in the bibliographies of the secondary sources you already have, the history journal articles, the scholarly history monographs, there probably are primary sources in those bibliographies, so you don't even have to go to a database to look for those.